you, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be splitting my time with the Member of Parliament for York South-Weston. Mr. Speaker, I begin my speech on the Conservative budget, my critique of the Conservative budget, by highlighting the fact that there are only 5 mentions of Newfoundland and Labrador in the entire 518-page document. 5 mentions, Mr. Speaker. As a representative of St. John's South Mount Pearl, one of Newfoundland and Labrador's 7 ridings, my priority is my riding and my province. And 5 mentions, one in a graph of crude oil prices, another in a stat about pensions, and the other 3 offhand mentions is not good enough, Mr. Speaker, not near good enough. Now, my critique is both good and bad, Mr. Speaker. Make no mistake, there is more bad. There always is with these Conservatives, Mr. Speaker. Not so much bad news, Mr. Speaker, as wrong priorities, Conservative priorities that are wrong for Canada, Conservative priorities that are changing the face of Canada, Conservative priorities that put the wealthy first, Mr. Speaker, that put the more affluent, the more influential first. And that's not who we are. It's not who we are as Newfoundlanders and Labradorians. It's not who we are as Canadians. It's not who we are, Mr. Speaker, but it is who this Conservative government wants us to become. And we cannot let that happen, Mr. Speaker. We will not let that happen. Let's go first, Mr. Speaker, to a piece of good news for Newfoundland and Labrador, or what would appear on the surface to be good news. In its budget, the Conservative government announced $5.7 million over 5 years to help secure new markets for Canadian seal products. Now that's good news, Mr. Speaker. That's welcome news. On the surface, it is. Now let's put that news in the context of where the sealing industry is today, Mr. Speaker. We have a $5.7 million pot to help secure new markets for seal products when, under this Conservative government, we've seen the biggest collapse of world seal markets in our history. Under this Conservative government, seal products have been banned in Russia, in the European Union, in Belarus, in Taiwan, in Kazakhstan. So, Mr. Speaker, that $5.7 million for seal marketing is just a little late coming. Now, that money is also a little late coming when you consider Carino, a Newfoundland and Labrador company that's the largest buyer of seal pelts in Canada. Carino isn't buying any seal pelts this year, Mr. Speaker. Instead, Carino is going to rely on its inventory. Now, that $5.7 million is also a little late coming, Mr. Speaker, when you consider the Canadian Sealers Association shut the doors of its St. John's office recently to reorganize because it was broke, Mr. Speaker. So better late than never with the $5.7 million for the sealing industry, I suppose, Mr. Speaker. What's clear is that this Conservative government has no right to bill itself as a champion of the seal hunt, because the facts, Mr. Speaker, they don't support it. Now, moving on, Mr. Speaker. This Conservative budget is also incredibly worrisome from Newfoundland and Labrador's perspective because of what it does not mention. Red flags waved all across Newfoundland and Labrador in February, Mr. Speaker, when the government released the main estimates. Now, as you know, Mr. Speaker, the main estimates lay out the expected spending of the federal government in the coming fiscal year. Now, the red flags were raised because the subsidy for Marine Atlantic, the Crown Corporation that runs the ferry link between Newfoundland and mainland Canada, has had its budget slashed. Now, Marine Atlantic's budget for this fiscal year, according to those main estimates, Mr. Speaker, has been set at $19.3 million. Now, that is a massive drop from the $127 million last year and $154 million the year before that, Mr. Speaker. So, I asked the minister in this House, before the budget was announced, whether Marine Atlantic would receive full funding. Now, the minister's response was to, quote, wait for the budget. Only there wasn't a word mentioned about Marine Atlantic in the budget, Mr. Speaker. There was not a whisper. A Gulf ferry link is guaranteed in Newfoundland's terms of union with Canada, Mr. Speaker. If Marine Atlantic's budget is indeed set at $19.3 million for this fiscal year, it will amount to the lowest amount of funding the corporation has received from the federal government going back at least 15 years. If Marine Atlantic's budget is indeed slashed, ferry rates are sure to rise. Now, why is that incredibly bad news, Mr. Speaker, besides the obvious? It's incredibly bad news because 60% of all freight going into or out of my province does so on a Marine Atlantic ferry. Slashing the federal subsidy will jack up the rates, and increasing the ferry rates will drive up the price of everything, Mr. Speaker. So what's the score, Mr. Speaker? Is this government preparing to punish Newfoundlanders and Labradorians? Is this government preparing to ignore the spirit of the terms of union? Mr. Speaker, the leader of this government once described Atlantic Canada as having a culture of defeat, but it is this government, Mr. Speaker, that has a defeatist attitude towards Atlantic Canada. This government has turned its back on Atlantic Canada, and not before spitting in the eye of Newfoundland and Labrador. Maybe payback for Danny Williams' anyone but conservative campaign. It's like we don't matter, Mr. Speaker. We're only 32 seats in Atlantic Canada. This conservative government is not good for Atlantic Canada, Mr. Speaker. This government is not good for the country. Now, Mr. Speaker, the Canadians who will most benefit from this budget are the wealthiest 15%. The wealthiest 15% are the ones who will qualify for income splitting. They're also the ones who will be able to put away $10,000 cash into a tax-free savings account, which the Conservatives have almost doubled from $5,500 to $10,000 in their budget. What typical family, Mr. Speaker, what typical family will benefit from the Conservative budget? The typical family, as outlined on page 6 of the budget document, is a family of 4, a couple with 2 children. The man, according to the example, the typical family, the man earns $84,000 a year while the woman earns $36,000 for a total household income of $120,000 a year, Mr. Speaker, which puts that typical conservative family at the top 15% in terms of income. That is their example, Mr. Speaker. It is not my example. There's nothing typical about that household income. That will tell you who the conservative target group is, Mr. Speaker. It is the wealthy. The difference, Mr. Speaker, between the typical family in this conservative budget and the typical family in previous conservative budgets is that the man of the family now makes a lot more. In all previous years, Mr. Speaker, all previous conservative examples, the woman, Mr. Speaker, was the biggest breadwinner. In the income splitting year, Mr. Speaker, this year, the man suddenly has the biggest income. Sounds like the old boys club to me, Mr. Speaker. Now let me quote my party's finance critic, the MP for Skeena-Buckley Valley. Now he says that this conservative budget's family example is all about politics. It's not about fairly illustrating tax policy. Quote, Mr. Speaker, the Conservatives' imaginary typical family doesn't reflect the reality of Canadian families. They make almost twice as much as the real average Canadian family. Continuing on with the quote, Mr. Speaker, they benefit from boutique tax credits that most real families, Mr. Speaker, don't make enough to qualify for. Now, there's an expression worth repeating, Mr. Speaker, boutique tax credits. Now, I would go so far, Mr. Speaker, as to call this a boutique budget. Only most Canadians, only most Newfoundlanders and Labradorians can afford to shop at boutiques, Mr. Speaker, which tells you this, Mr. Speaker. If I can cut to the chase and summarize what Canadians, what Newfoundlanders and Labradorians should take away from this conservative budget, Mr. Speaker, they should take away this. It is that we cannot afford to vote conservative in the next election. As for the Conservatives' boast, Mr. Speaker, as for the Conservatives' boast that this is a balanced budget written in black ink, I disagree, Mr. Speaker. This budget is written in conservative blue ink, whereby balancing the budget means raiding the EI fund, it means robbing the emergency contingency fund, balancing the budget, Mr. Speaker, by creating such an imbalance in incomes and directed tax breaks is nothing to boast about, Mr. Speaker. It is shameful. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable friend for his presentation. I'm troubled by something about this budget that I just want to raise. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to present a full speech on the 2015 budget this year just due to the difficulties of finding a speaking slot that didn't interfere with the National Holocaust Remembrance. But what I would have wanted to say, had I had the opportunity, was that we've lost track of a fundamental principle of parliamentary democracy, which is that Parliament must control the public purse. Increasingly, budgets have become big, thick brochures for a government in power, particularly under the current Conservative administration. We no longer have the index at the back of a budget, which actually shows us what each department gets to spend, how it compares to the previous year, how it compares to years going forward. So we have absolutely no idea from this budget what the funding will be for international development assistance, what the funding will be for fisheries and oceans, what the funding will be for Parks Canada. Indeed, no department spending is detailed here. And so parliamentarians are essentially voting on a pig in a poke. If we respected the principle that Parliament controls the public purse, none of us should vote because none of us have accurate information.
The honourable member for St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Before I became Member of Parliament for St. John's South, Mount Pearl, Mr. Speaker, I was a journalist. I was an editor of a newspaper. I was at one point I was a political reporter, and I was locked up in more than one budget lockup, Mr. Speaker, analyzing provincial government budgets in Newfoundland and Labrador. And what I find different about this budget and the 518-page document we got with this Conservative budget versus budgets that I covered in the past as a journalist, Mr. Speaker, is exactly what this member pointed out, is the absence of detail. Marine Atlantic, for example, Mr. Speaker, I was told, as I outlined in my speech, that we would find out what's going on with Marine Atlantic's budget in the budget document. It's nowhere to be found. And now I was told today by the minister that it may be included in some estimates that are released in May. In May? That's not good enough, Mr. Speaker. There should be more detail.
Question et commentaire à l'honorable député de la Salle-et-Mer.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais remercier mon collègue pour son discours, pour sa passion et également pour les points qui font énormément de bon sens. Moi aussi, j'étais désagréablement surpris par l'exemple qu'on a donné parce qu'on a démontré, encore une fois, que la famille canadienne, de plus en plus, il y a des écarts salariaux de plus en plus grandissants entre les hommes et les femmes, et je l'ai mentionné également dans mon discours précédemment. Alors, j'aimerais qu'il me dise qu'est-ce qu'il voit dans l'avenir par rapport à ces inégalités-là et comment un gouvernement des hauts-démocrates pourrait réduire justement les inégalités entre les hommes et les femmes, les écarts salariales entre les hommes et les femmes.
The honourable member, St. John's South, Mount Pearl.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Well, what's going to happen is there's going to be a change, and the change will be the fact that we will have a new federal government. We will have a new democratic government, and we'll have a new Prime Minister of Canada, and our priorities will change. But if I can reflect back, Mr. Speaker, to the speech, and again, the typical family, as outlined in the budget on page 6, makes $120,000 a year, and that is an example of the federal Conservatives of a typical family in Canada. When $120,000 for a family income represents the top 15% wealthiest in the country, and that is, I don't know, I guess I shouldn't call it out to lunch because it just shows what the Conservative priorities are, and the Conservative priorities are not the real typical Canadian family. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
It being 5:37 p.m., it is my duty